You don't belong in priority boarding. Step aside. The words snapped across gate B12 like a metal door slamming shut, loud enough to cut through the steady hum of rolling suitcases and boarding announcements, loud enough that conversations paused mid-sentence and heads turned in quiet synchronization toward the source of the disruption. Naomi Carter didn't flinch. Not outwardly. She stood there in a simple gray hoodie, dark jeans, and worn white sneakers, her boarding pass held calmly between two fingers, as if the paper itself carried more weight than the accusation thrown at her. The flight attendant, Emily Rhodes, stood rigid at the scanner, her uniform crisp, her smile gone, replaced by something colder, sharper, something practiced. Around them, passengers in tailored coats and polished shoes shifted slightly, their eyes scanning Naomi up and down, measuring, judging, deciding without words. Naomi had seen that look before. She recognized it the way you recognize a song you wish you could forget. It wasn't new. It wasn't surprising. But it was always the same. Emily extended a hand, palm out, not to receive the boarding pass, but to stop her. Priority boarding is for eligible passengers only, she said, slower this time, as if clarity required condescension. Naomi's voice, when it came, was steady, almost too calm. I am eligible. She lifted the pass slightly, just enough for the barcode to catch the overhead light. For a split second, the scanner beeped green. A clean, undeniable confirmation. But Emily didn't look at the screen. She looked at Naomi. And then she shook her head. That must be a system error. The line behind Naomi shifted again. A man in a navy blazer glanced at his watch. A woman with a designer carry-on leaned slightly to the side, trying to see past Naomi, as if impatience alone could move her out of the way. Then, without hesitation, Emily waved the next passenger forward, a white woman in heels and a cream-colored coat. The scanner beeped again. Green. You're good to go, Emily said, her tone suddenly warm, almost welcoming. Naomi didn't move. Not yet. The space around her tightened, the air growing heavier, charged with something unspoken but unmistakable. Excuse me, Naomi said, not louder, just clearer. My pass scanned. Emily sighed, a small, controlled exhale that carried more dismissal than frustration. Like I said, it's a mistake. Please step aside so we can keep the line moving. The words were polite on the surface, but the meaning underneath was anything but. Naomi felt the familiar pull of memory, a quiet echo from years ago, standing beside her father at another airport, another gate, watching him handle a similar moment with the same stillness, the same refusal to shrink. She remembered what he told her then, his voice low, certain. Never argue with ignorance. Let the truth arrive on its own. Naomi's grip on the boarding pass tightened just slightly. Around her, phones began to lift, subtle at first, then more obvious. A young man a few feet back angled his camera, pretending to check a message while recording. Another passenger whispered, "Didn't that scan?" The question hung in the air, unanswered but not unnoticed. Emily's posture stiffened. "Ma'am, if you don't step aside, we will have to call security." The word security landed differently. It always did. Naomi exhaled slowly, her gaze steady, not on Emily, but past her, toward the jet bridge, toward the plane waiting beyond, toward the space she had every right to enter. "Go ahead," she said quietly. "Call them." The murmur grew louder now, a ripple moving through the gate area. Someone said, "This doesn't look right." Another voice, sharper, "She just scanned in." Emily's jaw tightened, her composure beginning to crack at the edges. "This is not up for debate," she said, louder now, as if volume could restore control. But something had already shifted. The moment had stretched too far, the tension too visible, the witnesses too aware. Naomi stood there, unmoving, anchored in place not by defiance, but by certainty. She wasn't guessing. She wasn't hoping. She knew exactly where she belonged. And she knew something else too. This wasn't the end of the moment. It was the beginning of it. The gate area did not return to normal after that moment. It shifted into something else entirely, something heavier, something that could not be undone by a polite smile or a quick apology, and Naomi Carter felt it in the way the air pressed against her shoulders, in the way every small movement now seemed louder than it should have been, the rolling of a suitcase, the tapping of a phone screen. Even the distant announcement of another flight boarding across the terminal sounded sharper. Closer, like the entire airport had leaned in to watch. What would happen next? And still Naomi did not move. Not forward, not back, just steady, grounded, her posture quiet but unyielding as Emily Rhodes reached for her tablet and began tapping rapidly, her fingers moving with the kind of urgency that came from needing control more than seeking truth. Name, Emily said without looking up, her tone clipped, transactional now, stripped of any pretense of courtesy. And Naomi answered without hesitation, Naomi Carter, the name landing cleanly. Between them, simple, direct, unembellished. But something in Emily's expression flickered for just a fraction of a second. Not recognition, not yet, but something closer to irritation, as if the name itself refused to fit the narrative she had already decided on. I do not see you on the priority list, Emily said, turning the screen slightly toward herself as if shielding it. As if the information belonged only to her interpretation, not to the reality it represented. Naomi's eyes followed the movement, not to challenge, not to argue, but to observe, to confirm what she already suspected, and then she said quietly, then check again. Not a demand, not a plea, just a statement, steady as the floor beneath them. Behind her the murmurs grew, no longer whispers but fragments of sentences. She said her name. Why not just scan it again? This is getting weird. And somewhere to her left, a young woman in a Navy uniform, a junior staff member barely out of training, shifted her weight and spoke up, hesitant but clear enough to cut through the noise. I saw her name earlier, she said, her voice small but firm. She is on the list. And for a brief moment the entire scene paused, like a held breath, like the story had reached a point where it could still turn back, still correct itself. But Emily did not pause. She did not reconsider. She did not even look at the junior staff member. Instead, she exhaled sharply and tapped the screen again. Harder this time. The system updates constantly, she replied, her voice carrying a defensive edge now. If she was removed, then she was removed for a reason. The words landed with finality, but they did not settle. They hung in the air, questioned by the silence that followed. Naomi felt the weight of that silence and let it sit, let it stretch, because she knew something. Emily did not. Something the system itself would confirm eventually. And still she said nothing more, her restraint not passive but intentional. Every second she remained calm shifted the balance further, made the contrast clearer, made the moment sharper for everyone watching. Emily straightened her posture and looked past Naomi again, signaling to the line, trying to re-establish order. Next passenger, she called. But no one stepped forward immediately, the hesitation subtle but undeniable. People were watching now, not just passing through, not just waiting for their turn, and that changed everything. The junior staff member glanced down at her own device, her fingers hovering as if deciding whether to check, whether to confirm, whether to speak again, and then she did, softer this time but closer, stepping slightly toward Naomi. Ma'am, your boarding group is listed as priority, she said, and this time Emily did look at her, sharply, a warning in her eyes that needed no words. That is enough, Emily snapped, her voice rising just enough to reclaim authority. Stick to your assigned position. The junior staff member stepped back, her courage meeting the boundary it was not yet strong enough to cross. But the damage had already been done. The doubt was visible now, the inconsistency exposed. Naomi turned her head slightly, just enough to meet the young woman's eyes. A brief acknowledgement, a silent thank you. And then she faced forward again, her attention returning to Emily, who was now reaching for the phone at the counter, her movements more deliberate, more rigid, as if each action needed to reinforce the version of reality she was holding on to. Security will be here shortly, Emily said, her voice steady again but thinner now, stretched over something that no longer felt certain. Naomi nodded once, a small, almost imperceptible motion, not agreement, not acceptance, just recognition of what was coming. And in that moment, as the tension thickened and the crowd leaned closer without stepping forward, Naomi felt the echo of her father's voice again, not loud, not urgent, just present, reminding her that truth did not need to rush, it only needed to arrive. And she stood there, exactly where she was, knowing that when it did, It would not just correct a mistake, it would expose everything that led to it. The sound of approaching footsteps did not arrive all at once. It built gradually. Measured, deliberate, the kind of presence that signaled authority before a single word was spoken. And when the uniformed security officer stepped into the boarding lane, the entire gate seemed to shift again, not louder, but tighter, like a circle drawing in around a center that could no longer be ignored. "What seems to be the issue here?" he asked, his voice calm, neutral, trained to diffuse but also to assert. And Emily turned toward him immediately, relief flashing across her face like reinforcement had finally arrived. "She is refusing to comply with boarding protocol," Emily said, gesturing toward Naomi without looking at her directly, as if eye contact might complicate the narrative she had already constructed. "Her name is not on the priority list, and she is holding up the line." The officer nodded slowly, his gaze shifting to Naomi, taking in her posture, her stillness. The boarding pass still in her hand, and for a brief second there was something like hesitation in his expression, not doubt exactly, but awareness, as if he sensed the imbalance in the situation even before understanding it fully. "Ma'am," he said, his tone respectful but firm. "Do you mind stepping aside so we can sort this out?" Naomi met his eyes, steady, unhurried, and shook her head once, not defiant, not aggressive, just certain. "I do mind," she said, her voice even, carrying just enough to be heard by those closest to her. And the words landed differently than expected, not escalating the situation, but anchoring it, forcing it to remain exactly where it was, visible, undeniable. The officer shifted his weight slightly, adjusting his stance, recalibrating. "If there is a misunderstanding, we can resolve it quickly," he continued. "But we need to keep the boarding process moving." Naomi nodded slightly, acknowledging the logic without accepting the conclusion. "Then resolve it here," she replied, "because my pass scanned, and I am not stepping aside for something that is not my mistake." Behind her, the murmurs sharpened again, more voices now, less hesitant. "She is right," someone said. "Just check the system," another voice added. "Why is this even happening?" The pressure was no longer subtle. It was building, not chaotic, but focused, directed, and Emily felt it, her posture stiffening further as she stepped closer to the officer, lowering her voice just enough to suggest urgency. "We cannot have passengers challenging staff decisions at the gate," she said. "If we allow that, we lose control of the boarding process." The officer glanced at her, then back at Naomi, caught between procedure and perception, between maintaining order and recognizing when order had already been disrupted by something else. Naomi remained exactly where she was, not moving forward, not retreating. Her presence now less about a seat on a plane and more about the line that had been drawn in front of her, a line she refused to accept. And then Emily made a decision, one that shifted the entire moment again. She reached for her tablet and tapped quickly, her movements sharper now, more aggressive, as if speed could solidify her authority. "I am removing her from the boarding list," she said, not to Naomi, not even to the officer, but to the situation itself, declaring a solution that bypassed the problem entirely. The junior staff member's eyes widened. "You cannot do that," she said before she could stop herself, her voice breaking through the tension with unexpected clarity. "Her status is confirmed." Emily turned to her immediately, her expression hardening. "Do you want to keep your job?" she asked quietly, the words controlled but unmistakable, and the young woman fell silent, her courage meeting the reality of consequence. But the moment had already been seen, already been understood. Naomi watched the exchange without interruption, her expression unchanged, but something deeper settled into place. A recognition not just of what was happening, but of how far it had gone. This was no longer a misunderstanding. It was a choice, repeated, reinforced, defended, and she let that realization sit for a second longer before moving her hand, not toward the boarding gate, not toward the officer, but toward her phone, the motion small but precise, deliberate. She unlocked it and scrolled once, her thumb steady, her breathing even, and then she lifted it to her ear, not rushed, not dramatic, just inevitable. The officer noticed the shift immediately, his attention narrowing. Emily did too, her confidence flickering again. "Who are you calling?" she asked, the question sharper than she intended, and Naomi answered without looking at her, her gaze fixed forward, her voice low but clear enough to carry. "My dad," she said, and there was something in the way she said it that changed the air again, not because of the word itself, but because of the certainty behind it, the absence of hesitation, the quiet expectation that followed. The phone rang once, twice, and then a voice answered on the other end. Calm, steady, familiar. "Naomi," he said, and Naomi closed her eyes for just a fraction of a second, grounding herself in that voice before she spoke. "Dad," she said softly. "I think it is happening again." And the gate, already tense, seemed to hold its breath, because something in that sentence suggested that this moment was not isolated, not accidental, but part of something larger, something that had happened before and was about to be answered now. The voice on the other end of the line did not rush, did not react with confusion or panic. It settled into the moment with a calm that felt practiced, precise, the kind of calm that came from experience rather than assumption. "Tell me exactly what is happening," her father said, his tone low and controlled, and Naomi opened her eyes, her gaze still forward, her posture unchanged as the entire gate area leaned closer without stepping in. "They scanned my boarding pass," she said, her voice steady. "It came back valid, but they said it was an error, and now they removed me from the list." There was a brief pause, not empty, but deliberate, like someone processing information in layers rather than reacting to it on the surface. "Who is they?" he asked, and Naomi answered without hesitation. "Gate agent, Emily Rhodes." The name landed clearly, and for the first time, Emily's composure shifted in a way she could not hide, not fully, her shoulders tightening, her grip on the tablet adjusting slightly as if the device itself had suddenly become heavier in her hands. The security officer glanced between them, his attention sharpening, sensing that the situation had moved beyond a standard protocol dispute. Naomi continued, not raising her voice, not adding emotion, just facts. "There is also a junior staff member who confirmed my status before it was changed." Another pause, shorter this time, more focused, and then her father spoke again. "Put me on speaker." Naomi did not move immediately. She let the request sit for a second, not out of hesitation, but because she understood what that shift would mean, not just for her, but for everyone standing within earshot. Then she tapped the screen once and lowered the phone slightly, the speaker activating with a soft click that somehow sounded louder than anything else in the moment. "You are on speaker," she said, and the voice that followed carried differently now, no longer private, no longer contained. It filled the space with quiet authority. "This is David Carter," he said, not loudly, not aggressively, but with a clarity that cut through the noise like a line drawn in ink. "I need to speak with the acting supervisor at Gate B12. Immediately." The effect was immediate but subtle, not explosive, not dramatic, just a shift in posture, in attention, in awareness. The security officer straightened slightly, his stance adjusting as if the name alone required recalibration. Emily blinked once, then twice, her expression tightening as she processed the introduction. "Sir, we are currently handling a boarding issue," she began, her tone attempting to regain control, but it lacked the certainty it held before. "Then you are handling it incorrectly," David Carter replied, his voice still even, still measured, but now carrying something sharper beneath it. Not anger, but precision, because you have just removed a confirmed passenger from a priority list without cause, and you did so after verification. The words landed one by one, each one narrowing the space Emily had left to defend her position. The junior staff member looked down, then back up, her silence now louder than anything she could have said. The crowd around them had gone quiet, not out of disinterest, but because something larger than the moment itself was unfolding, something that required attention, not commentary. Emily swallowed, her grip tightening again on the tablet. "Sir, the system indicated an inconsistency," she said, her voice carefully controlled, choosing each word as if it might hold the situation together. "Then check the system again," David said, the response immediate, unwavering. "And this time, do not adjust it before you read it." The statement hung in the air, not an accusation, not explicitly, but close enough that it carried weight. The security officer shifted his stance again, now looking directly at the tablet in Emily's hands, his role no longer just to enforce order, but to observe it, to understand where it had been disrupted. Emily hesitated, just for a fraction of a second, and in that hesitation, the entire narrative she had constructed began to thin, to show the cracks beneath it. Naomi stood still, listening, not intervening, not adding anything, because she did not need to. The moment was no longer hers to carry alone. It had expanded. It had drawn in systems, authority, accountability. And then David spoke again, his voice lower now, more focused. "I am going to ask you one more time," he said. "Pull up Naomi Carter's boarding status and read it exactly as it appears. No interpretation, no adjustment." The request was simple, but the weight behind it was unmistakable. Emily's fingers hovered over the screen, her options narrowing with every second she delayed, and around her, the silence deepened, not empty, but expectant, because everyone there could feel it now. The shift, the turning point, the moment where the truth was no longer something that could be managed, but something that was about to arrive, fully, completely, and Naomi, still standing exactly where she had been told she did not belong, knew that when it did, it would not just correct the system, it would expose everything that had tried to override it. Emily's fingers did not move at first. They hovered just above the screen, as if the tablet itself had become a decision rather than a tool. And in that suspended second, the entire gate seemed to narrow its focus onto her hands, onto the choice she had not yet made. The security officer's gaze fixed on the device, the junior staff member holding her breath without realizing it. The passengers silent now in a way that was no longer casual but intentional, and Naomi stood in the center of it all. Still, grounded, her phone resting lightly in her hand with her father's voice steady on speaker, waiting, not pushing, not repeating himself, because he did not need to. The weight of his last instruction was still present, still active, and Emily knew it. She exhaled slowly, the sound barely audible but visible in the way her shoulders shifted, and then finally her fingers touched the screen, tapping once, then again, slower this time, deliberate, as if each movement had to be justified. The system responded instantly. It always did. Lines of information populating the display in neat, structured clarity. But this time there was no room to adjust it, no opportunity to reshape what it showed before it was seen, because now she was not the only one watching. "Read it," David Carter said calmly through the speaker, his voice unchanged, not louder, not sharper, just present, unwavering, and Emily's throat tightened slightly, the words forming before she wanted them to. "Naomi Carter," she began, her voice controlled but thinner now. "Priority boarding. Group 1, status confirmed." The sentence landed in full, complete, undeniable, and for a moment nothing followed, no explanation, no correction, just silence, thick and immediate, the kind that arrives when something obvious has been withheld for too long. The junior staff member lowered her gaze, a small exhale escaping her, as if she had been holding it since the moment she first spoke up. The security officer shifted his stance again, his posture no longer neutral but attentive in a different way, his role now clearly aligned with what had been revealed rather than what had been claimed, and Emily remained still, her eyes fixed on the screen as if it might change if she stared at it long enough, but it did not. It stayed exactly as it was, because it had always been exactly as it was. Naomi listened without moving, without reacting outwardly, but inside something settled, not relief, not satisfaction, something quieter, something deeper, the confirmation of what she already knew, the validation of standing still when everything around her tried to move her out of place. "Thank you," David said after a brief pause, his tone still measured, but now carrying a different kind of weight. Not inquiry, not instruction, but conclusion. "Now explain why a confirmed passenger was denied access, removed from the system, and threatened with security intervention." The question did not rush. It did not accuse directly, but it left no space to avoid the answer. Emily's lips parted slightly, then closed, the response forming and dissolving at the same time, because there was no version of it that aligned with what had just been read. "There was a misunderstanding," she said. Finally, the words careful, chosen, but fragile, lacking the structure they needed to hold under scrutiny. "No," David replied immediately, his voice still calm, but now unmistakably firm. A misunderstanding does not involve altering a passenger's status after verification, and it does not involve dismissing a secondary confirmation from your own staff. The junior staff member looked up briefly, her eyes meeting Naomi's again, this time not with hesitation, but with quiet acknowledgement. The crowd shifted slightly, the silence now carrying a different tone, not anticipation, but recognition. They were no longer waiting to see what would happen. They were witnessing what had already been exposed. Emily swallowed again, her grip loosening just slightly on the tablet, the control she had tried to maintain now slipping in ways she could not recover. "Sir, we were following protocol," she said, the phrase sounding more like a shield than an explanation, and David responded without pause. "Then your protocol needs to be reviewed immediately." The statement landed with finality, not loud, not aggressive, but definitive, and for the first time since the moment began, Emily did not have a response ready. She stood there, the structure she had relied on no longer supporting her, the system she had tried to control now reflecting something back at her that she could not redirect, and Naomi, still in the same place she had been told she did not belong, remained exactly as she was, because now, the moment was no longer about proving anything. It was about what would happen next, and she knew, with the same quiet certainty she had held from the beginning, that this was not the end of it. Not yet, because the truth had arrived, but the consequences were just beginning to follow. The silence did not break all at once. It shifted, deepened, transformed into something heavier than tension, something closer to accountability settling into the space. And Naomi could feel it in the way the room no longer questioned her presence, but began to question everything that had challenged it. The security officer stepped back half a pace, not retreating, but repositioning. His role now clearly aligned with what had been confirmed rather than what had been claimed, and Emily Rhodes stood frozen for a fraction longer than she intended, her grip on the tablet loosening as if the device itself had lost its authority in her hands. "Naomi." Her father's voice came again through the speaker, steady, grounded. "Are you still being denied boarding?" The question was simple, direct, and Naomi answered just as simply. "Yes," she said, her voice calm, unchanged. And that single word seemed to land harder than anything that had come before it, because now there was no confusion left, no uncertainty to hide behind, just a clear line between what was right and what had been done. "Understood," David replied, and there was a subtle shift in his tone now, not louder, not emotional, but decisive, like a switch had been flipped from observation to action. "Stay exactly where you are," he continued. "Do not move. Do not step aside. Do not let them redirect you." Naomi nodded slightly, though he could not see it, the instruction aligning perfectly with what she had already chosen, and then he added, "I am initiating a review from my end." The words were quiet, but they carried weight, not because of how they were said, but because of what they implied, the kind of authority that did not need to explain itself to be understood. Emily's eyes flickered again, this time not at Naomi, but toward the terminal behind her, toward the operations desk further down the corridor, as if she suddenly became aware of a wider system she could no longer control. "Sir, there is no need to escalate this," she said quickly, her voice tightening at the edges. "We can resolve it here." But David did not respond immediately, and in that pause, something else happened. A notification tone sounded from Emily's tablet, soft but distinct, followed by another from the terminal monitor behind her, and then another from the handheld device of a nearby crew member. The sounds were small individually, but together they formed a pattern, a signal that something had shifted beyond the immediate scene. The junior staff member glanced down at her own screen, her eyes widening slightly as she read. The security officer noticed too, his gaze moving from Naomi to Emily to the devices now lighting up in sequence. "What is that?" he asked quietly, not demanding, just observing. Emily did not answer right away, her attention fixed on the tablet as she tapped through a new alert that had overridden her previous screen, her posture changing again, this time not defensive, not assertive, but uncertain. "There is an internal update," she said, the words slower now, less controlled, as if she was reading them as she spoke. The crowd leaned in again, not physically, but with their attention, drawn by the subtle but unmistakable shift in control. Naomi remained still, her phone still in her hand, her father's voice silent for the moment, allowing the system to speak in its own way, and then another tone sounded, louder this time, from the gate's main console, the kind of alert that was not routine, not easily dismissed, and Emily's face changed, not dramatically, but enough that those watching could see it. The certainty that had anchored her from the beginning now replaced by something else, something closer to realization. What does it say? The security officer asked again, his voice still calm, but now carrying more weight. Because the situation was no longer about a passenger refusing to comply, it was about a process that had just been interrupted from above. Emily hesitated, her eyes scanning the screen, and for a moment she did not speak at all, as if saying it out loud would make it more real, more final. Naomi watched her, not with triumph, not with satisfaction, but with clarity, because she knew this moment. She had seen it before, the exact second when the system that had been used against her corrected itself, not quietly, not subtly, but in a way that could not be ignored. And then Emily finally spoke, her voice lower now, almost careful. There has been a corporate override, she said, each word deliberate. Effective immediately, she continued. All boarding operations at this gate are under direct review. The sentence landed across the space like a shift in gravity, pulling every assumption down with it. The junior staff member looked up again, this time with something closer to relief than hesitation. The security officer straightened fully, his posture now aligned with a different chain of command, and Naomi stood exactly where she had been from the beginning, unchanged, unmoved, because this was what she had known would happen, not because she expected rescue, but because she trusted the truth to arrive, and now it had, not as a correction, but as a force that had begun to rewrite the moment entirely. The words corporate override did not echo loudly. They did something more powerful than that. They settled into the space like a verdict already decided, and for a moment no one moved. Not the passengers, not the security officer, not even Emily Rhodes, whose eyes remained locked on the screen as if she was waiting for the message to correct itself, to soften, to disappear, but it did not. It stayed exactly as it was, clear, precise, irreversible, and Naomi Carter stood at the center of it all, still exactly where she had been told she did not belong, her posture unchanged, her expression calm, because now the moment had shifted completely. It was no longer about her proving anything. It was about everyone else realizing what had already been proven. Naomi, her father's voice returned through the speaker, steady as ever. You are clear to proceed. The sentence was simple, almost understated, but it carried a finality that cut through the remaining tension like a clean line. Naomi nodded slightly, her fingers relaxing around her phone, but she did not step forward yet, not immediately, because something else needed to happen first, something the moment itself was demanding. Emily finally lifted her head, her composure no longer intact, her voice quieter now, almost careful. Ma'am, you may board, she said, the words sounding different this time, stripped of authority, stripped of certainty. More like a correction than an instruction, but Naomi did not move. Not yet. She looked at Emily, not with anger, not with satisfaction, but with clarity, and when she spoke, her voice carried just enough to reach the people who had been watching from the beginning. You told me I did not belong here, she said, each word measured, deliberate. But the system never said that. You did. The sentence landed with precision, not loud, not dramatic, but undeniable, and the silence that followed was immediate, complete, the kind that does not ask for more words because it already understands what has been said. The junior staff member lowered her gaze again, this time not out of hesitation, but reflection. The security officer shifted slightly, his posture now fully aligned with Naomi, not as protection, but as recognition of what had been made clear, and Emily stood there, her authority gone, her certainty replaced by something else entirely, something closer to realization than defense. Naomi took a small step forward then, not rushed, not hesitant, just steady, her movement quiet but definitive as she approached the scanner again, the same device that had already confirmed her place once before, and this time no one stopped her, no hand raised, no voice interrupted. The scanner beeped green again, the same sound, the same confirmation, but now it carried a different weight, not just validation, but exposure, proof not only of her status, but of everything that had been done to deny it. Naomi paused for a brief second at the threshold of the jet bridge, not turning back fully, but just enough to let her voice carry one last time. "You did not deny a seat," she said, her tone calm, unwavering. "You exposed your decision." The words settled into the space like a final note, not loud, not aggressive, but complete. And then she continued forward, stepping onto the jet bridge with the same quiet confidence she had held from the beginning, leaving behind a gate that no longer felt the same, a space that had shifted from routine to reckoning in a matter of minutes. Behind her, the crowd remained still for a moment longer, processing, absorbing, and then slowly, almost naturally, the line began to move again, but it moved differently now, not just in order, but with awareness, with the understanding that something had just happened that could not be unseen. And at the center of it all, Emily Rhodes stood motionless for a second longer, her tablet still in her hands, the screen still displaying the truth she had tried to override, the system unchanged, but the moment completely rewritten. The jet bridge swallowed the noise behind her almost instantly, the hum of the terminal fading into a distant blur as Naomi Carter walked forward with the same steady rhythm she had carried from the gate, each step quiet, controlled, unhurried. And yet the weight of what had just happened did not stay behind. It followed her, not as pressure, but as presence, the kind that lingers in the air even after the moment has passed. And halfway down the narrow corridor, she heard it again, the soft vibration of her phone, a single tone that cut through the silence just enough to draw her attention. She glanced down briefly and saw her father's name still active on the call, the line never disconnected, never abandoned, just waiting, consistent, like everything else he had done. "You handled that exactly right," he said, his voice calm, steady, but now carrying something else, something closer to pride than instruction. Naomi allowed herself a small exhale, the first one that felt different from the others, less measured, more human. "I did what you told me," she replied, her voice still even, but softer now, less guarded. "You did more than that," he said. "You stayed in place when the system tried to move you out of it. That is not easy." Naomi paused for a brief second as she reached the aircraft door, the open frame revealing the quiet order of the cabin beyond. Flight attendants now standing in place, their posture composed, their expressions neutral but attentive in a way that suggested they already knew something had shifted before she even stepped inside. "They changed it," Naomi said quietly, not as a question, but as an observation. "The system." There was a short pause on the other end, not hesitation, but confirmation. "No," her father replied. "They tried to change it. The system corrected them." The distinction was subtle, but it settled into her understanding immediately, and she nodded slightly as if he could see it, stepping forward into the cabin, the environment inside calm, controlled, everything in its proper place. But even here the awareness lingered. A few passengers already seated glanced up as she entered, not openly staring, but noticing, recognizing that something had preceded her arrival, something that had shifted the air before she walked through it. She moved down the aisle toward her seat, her boarding group now irrelevant, her place no longer questioned, just accepted, as it should have been from the beginning. And as she reached her row, she paused again, turning slightly toward the window before sitting, the light from the runway stretching across the seat in a clean, uninterrupted line. And for a moment she allowed herself to feel it, not the confrontation, not the tension, but the resolution, the quiet certainty that came from standing still when everything around her tried to move her. "Dad," she said softly into the phone. "What happens now?" The question was simple, but it carried more than curiosity. It carried the weight of what had been exposed, what had been revealed, what had been set in motion. And on the other end, David Carter did not rush his answer. He let the question settle, let the moment breathe, before responding. "Now," he said, his voice steady as ever, "the answer for it." The words were not dramatic, not loud, but they carried a finality that extended beyond the flight, beyond the gate, beyond the moment itself. Naomi sat down slowly, fastening her seatbelt with a quiet click, her movements precise, grounded, and as she looked out the window, the runway stretching ahead in long, straight lines under the evening sky, she understood something clearly, something deeper than the moment itself. This was never about boarding early. It was never about a seat. It was about being told where she did not belong and choosing not to accept it. And as the cabin settled, as the last passengers took their seats and the door prepared to close, Naomi Carter leaned back slightly, her posture relaxed but her presence unchanged. Because what had happened at that gate did not end when she stepped onto the plane. It had already moved beyond it, into systems, into decisions, into consequences that were now unfolding somewhere else, somewhere higher, somewhere that could not be ignored. And she did not need to see it to know it was happening. She only needed to trust what she had already seen. That truth, when left uninterrupted, does not just arrive. It stays, it corrects, and it leaves everything else to answer for itself. The cabin lights dimmed slightly as the aircraft door closed with a soft, final click, sealing the space not just physically but symbolically, separating what had happened from what was about to continue. And Naomi Carter sat still in her seat, her hands resting lightly on her lap, her phone now silent beside her. The call ended, but the presence of it still lingering in her mind like a steady echo. The kind that does not fade quickly because it was never loud to begin with. It was precise, intentional, and outside her window the runway lights stretched into the distance in clean, uninterrupted lines, guiding something forward, something inevitable. And for the first time since she stepped into the terminal that day, there was nothing in front of her trying to stop her, no voice questioning her place, no hand redirecting her path, just open space and forward motion. And yet the moment at the gate did not disappear. It settled deeper, not as a wound, not as anger, but as clarity, the kind that does not need to be repeated to be understood. A flight attendant paused briefly beside her row, her tone polite, measured. "Can I get you anything before takeoff?" Naomi looked up, meeting her eyes for a brief second, and shook her head gently. "I am fine, thank you." Her voice calm, composed, unchanged, and the attendant nodded, moving on without hesitation, without assumption, just acknowledgement. And that difference, subtle as it was, meant everything, because it was not forced, it was not corrected under pressure, it was simply how things should have been from the beginning. The plane began to move slowly then, a gradual pushback from the gate, the motion smooth, controlled, almost unnoticeable at first, but Naomi felt it, the shift from stillness to movement, from confrontation to continuation, and she let herself lean back slightly into the seat, her posture relaxed, but her presence still grounded, still aware. Because what had happened was not something she would forget, not because it defined her, but because it revealed something that needed to be seen, not just by her, but by everyone who had watched, everyone who had stayed silent, everyone who had spoken up. The engines grew louder as the aircraft turned toward the runway, the sound building steadily, not chaotic, but powerful, a force gathering beneath something controlled, directed, purposeful. And Naomi glanced out the window again, the lights passing by in steady rhythm, each one marking distance, marking progress, marking a path forward that no one could interrupt now. And in that moment she remembered something her father had told her years ago, not at an airport, not in a moment like this, but in a quiet conversation that had stayed with her ever since. "You do not raise your voice to prove your worth," he had said. "You stand in it until the room adjusts." And Naomi understood that now more clearly than ever, because she had not argued, she had not fought, she had not tried to convince anyone of who she was. She had simply remained where she belonged until the truth forced everything else to realign around it. The plane paused briefly at the edge of the runway, engines humming, waiting for clearance, and in that stillness, that final pause before acceleration, Naomi felt it completely, not tension, not anticipation, but resolution. The kind that does not need applause, does not need acknowledgement, it just exists, solid, undeniable. And when the aircraft finally began its takeoff roll, accelerating down the runway with increasing speed, Naomi did not look away. She kept her eyes forward, watching the ground blur into motion, watching the distance close behind her as the plane lifted, smooth and steady into the sky, leaving the terminal, the gate, the moment behind physically, but not erasing it, not diminishing it. Because what happened there did not stay there. It moved forward with her, not as a burden, but as a standard, something set, something clear, something that would not shift again. And as the city lights spread out below, small and distant against the darkening sky. Naomi Carter sat quietly, her expression calm, her presence unchanged, and if anyone had looked at her in that moment, they would not have seen someone who had just been challenged. They would have seen someone who had never moved, never lowered herself to meet the moment, but instead allowed the moment to rise to meet her, because she did not raise her voice. She raised the standard, and everything else had no choice but to follow.